Maple Street was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Kids rode their bikes freely, neighbors borrowed sugar from each other, and the biggest excitement was usually the annual block party every summer. In this quiet corner of Riverside, a small town where nothing ever seemed to happen, the Mitchell family stood out as the picture of perfection. David Mitchell worked as an accountant for the biggest firm in town. Every morning at exactly 7:30, he would walk out of his neat two-story house wearing a crisp suit and carrying his brown leather briefcase. His wife, Lisa, taught third grade at Riverside Elementary School, and every parent in town hoped their child would be lucky enough to get her class. She had this special way of making even the most difficult kids feel special and loved. Their twin daughters, Kate and Amy, were 8 years old and absolutely adorable. Kate had her mother's bright smile and loved painting pictures that Lisa would proudly display on their refrigerator. Amy was the more adventurous one, always climbing trees and collecting interesting rocks she found in their backyard. The girls were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and sharing that special bond that only twins seemed to have. Mrs. Dorothy June had lived in the house next door for over 40 years. She was 73 years old, a widow who spent most of her time tending to her garden and watching the neighborhood from her kitchen window. From that window, she had seen families come and go, children grow up, and the street evolve over the decades. But no family had ever captured her attention. Quite like the Mitchells, there was something almost magical about how perfect they seemed. Every Saturday morning, David would wash their blue sedan in the driveway while Lisa worked in their flower garden. The girls would play hopscotch on the sidewalk or help their mother plant new flowers. On Sunday afternoons, the whole family would take long walks around the neighborhood, always waving and stopping to chat with anyone they met along the way. Lisa Mitchell was the type of person who remembered everyone's birthday. She would show up at your door with homemade cookies when you were sick, and she organized the neighborhood Christmas caroling every year. David was equally loved in the community. He helped elderly neighbors with their taxes for free, coached Little League baseball on weekends, and never missed a town council meeting. The twins were just as wonderful as their parents. Kate and Amy were polite, well-behaved children who said please and thank you without being reminded. They helped carry groceries for older neighbors and always picked up any trash they found on their walks. Teachers at school often commented on how well-raised they were, and other parents would joke about wanting to know the Mitchell family secret to raising such perfect children. Mrs. Chun often found herself watching the family from her kitchen window, not out of nosiness, but out of genuine admiration. In a world that seemed to be getting more complicated every day, the Mitchells represented something pure and good. They reminded her of how families used to be when she was younger, when neighbors looked out for each other and children were taught proper values. The Mitchell house itself was as perfect as the family that lived in it. The white picket fence was always freshly painted. The lawn was perfectly manicured, and Lisa's flower garden was the envy of every woman on the street. In spring, their yard would explode with colorful tulips and daffodils. Summer brought roses and sunflowers that seemed to grow taller and more beautiful than anyone else's. Even in winter, their yard looked neat and well-maintained. David had built a beautiful wooden swing set in the backyard for the girls, and Mrs. Chun would often hear their delighted laughter as they played together after school. Lisa had hung bird feeders from several trees, attracting cardinals and blue jays that added even more life and beauty to their already perfect yard. Every evening, the family would gather on their front porch after dinner. David would read the newspaper while Lisa worked on her lesson plans for school. The girls would play quietly with their dolls or draw pictures with chalk on the sidewalk. It was like watching a scene from a classic family television show, where everything was wholesome and pure. The neighborhood children all looked up to Kate and Amy. Despite being only 8 years old, they were natural leaders who included everyone in their games and never said mean things about other kids. During summer vacation, their yard became the unofficial gathering place for children from the entire street. Lisa would bring out lemonade and homemade cookies, making every child feel welcome and special. Mrs. Chun remembered one particular Summer evening when she had been feeling especially lonely after the anniversary of her husband's death. Lisa had noticed her sitting alone on her porch and had walked over with a plate of fresh brownies and an invitation to join their family for dinner. That evening spent around the Mitchell dinner table, listening to the girls tell stories about their day and watching David help them with a puzzle, had lifted her spirits in a way she hadn't expected. The family attended Riverside Community Church every Sunday morning, sitting in the same pew week after week. Lisa sang in the choir, her beautiful voice adding to the peaceful atmosphere of the Sunday service. David helped with the church's financial planning, donating his accounting expertise to help manage their budget. The girls participated in Sunday school and were always eager to share what they had learned with anyone who would listen. During the week, their routine was as predictable as clockwork. David would leave for work at 7:30 sharp. Lisa would walk the girls to school at 8:15, and she would return home by 4:30 in the afternoon. The girls would play in their yard until dinner time, and the whole family would be inside by dark. Lights would go out by 10 o'clock, and the cycle would begin again the next morning. This peaceful routine continued for 3 wonderful years after the Mitchells moved to Maple Street. Mrs. Chun had grown to think of them as the children and grandchildren she had never had. She looked forward to watching their daily activities and felt a warm comfort knowing that such a loving family lived right next door. But on a crisp October morning in 1993, something felt different. Mrs. Chen noticed that David's car was still in the driveway at 8 o'clock, long after he should have left for work. The girls hadn't come out to play, and Lisa's flower garden showed no signs of her usual morning attention. The house that had always buzzed with activity and warmth now sat silent and still, as if holding its breath. That silence would stretch on for days, then weeks, then years, becoming the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Maple Street and change Mrs. Chen's life forever. Detective Robert Thompson had been working for the Riverside Police Department for 15 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. When Mrs. Chun called the police on that Thursday morning, her voice trembling with worry, she explained that she hadn't seen the Mitchell family for 4 days. The mailbox was overflowing, newspapers were piled up on the driveway, and their car sat untouched in the garage. At first, Robert thought it might be a simple case of a family taking an unexpected trip. Families sometimes left town without telling neighbors, especially if it was a last-minute emergency. But something in Mrs. Chen's voice made him decide to take a closer look. She had known this family for 3 years, watched them every single day, and she insisted that this wasn't normal behavior for the Mitchells. When Robert arrived at the Mitchell house that afternoon, he immediately understood Mrs. Chen's concern. The house looked abandoned, yet everything appeared perfectly normal. The lawn was still neatly trimmed, the flowers in Lisa's garden were well watered, and there were no signs of any struggle or break-in. He knocked on the front door several times, calling out their names, but received no answer. Robert walked around the entire house, checking all the windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. He peered through the windows and could see that the inside of the house looked just as neat and organized as always. Beds were made, dishes appeared to be clean and put away, and there was no indication that anything violent had happened inside. The next step was to contact David's workplace. Robert drove to Mitchell Accounting Firm, where David had worked for 7 years. His boss, Mr. Harold Peterson, was genuinely surprised to hear that David hadn't been home. He explained that David had called in sick on Monday morning, saying he had a family emergency and wouldn't be in for the rest of the week. This was completely unlike David, who had only missed work twice in all his years at the company. Mr. Peterson mentioned something that caught Robert's attention. On the Friday before David disappeared, he had seemed nervous and distracted. He had asked several questions about the company's financial procedures and had stayed late that evening, which was unusual for him. When Robert asked to see David's office and files, Mr. Peterson gladly agreed to cooperate with the investigation. David's office looked normal at first glance, but Robert noticed that his desk had been cleaned out more thoroughly than usual. Important client files that David typically kept on his desk were missing, and his computer had been wiped clean. Mr. Peterson confirmed that this was strange behavior, as David was usually very organized but never removed all his working files. From his desk, the school provided similar information about Lisa. She had called Riverside Elementary on Monday morning, speaking to the principal, Mrs. Rebecca Foster. Lisa had explained that she was dealing with a family emergency and would need to take the rest of the week off. She had sounded upset and stressed, which was very unlike her usual calm and cheerful personality. Mrs. Foster had offered to help in any way possible, but Lisa had quickly ended the conversation. The twins had also been absent from school that entire week. Their teacher, Miss Jennifer Walsh, said that Kate and Amy were model students who had never missed school without proper notification. The last time she had seen them was the previous Friday, and both girls had seemed perfectly happy and normal. Robert decided to interview the neighbors to get a better picture of the family's final days. Mrs. Chun was his most valuable source of information. She explained that over the weekend she had noticed unusual activity at the Mitchell house. On Saturday night, she had seen David loading several large suitcases into their car around 10 o'clock at night. This struck her as odd because the family usually went to bed early and never did anything outside after dark on Sunday. Mrs. Chen had seen Lisa working in her garden, but she appeared upset and was crying. When Mrs. Chun had waved and called out to her, Lisa had quickly gone back inside the house without responding. This was completely unlike Lisa, who always stopped to chat with neighbors and was never rude to anyone. The mailman, Gary Wilson, provided another piece of the puzzle. He mentioned that on Monday morning, David had been waiting for him at the mailbox, which was unusual. David had asked about mail forwarding services and seemed very interested in how quickly mail could be redirected to a new address. Gary had assumed the family was planning to move, but David hadn't mentioned anything specific about when or where they were going. Robert's investigation took a more serious turn when he discovered financial irregularities. With proper legal permission, he was able to access the Mitchell family's bank records. What he found was shocking. On the Friday, before they disappeared, David had withdrawn $50,000 in cash from their savings account. This represented almost all of their family's money, accumulated over years of careful saving. The bank manager, Mrs. Patricia Williams, remembered the transaction because it was so unusual. David had seemed nervous and had requested the money in small bills. When she had asked if everything was all right, David had explained that they were making a large cash purchase for a family investment. Mrs. Williams had processed the withdrawal, but had thought it was strange behavior for someone as financially conservative as David. Robert also discovered that David had been making unusual inquiries about selling their house quickly. A local real estate agent, Mr. Tom Bradley, reported that David had called him the week before the disappearance, asking about how fast a house could be sold and whether it was possible to sell without his wife's signature. Mr. Bradley had explained the legal requirements, but David had seemed disappointed with the answers. As the investigation continued, Robert began to uncover more disturbing evidence. He learned that David had been working late many evenings in the weeks before the disappearance, which was unusual for him. His coworkers mentioned that he had seemed stressed and distracted, often making small mistakes in his work that were unlike his normally careful personality. The search expanded beyond Riverside. Robert contacted police departments in surrounding states, asking them to watch for the Mitchell family's blue sedan. He also reached out to federal authorities, wondering if the family might have crossed state lines. Missing person reports were filed, and the family's information was entered into national databases. Despite extensive searching, interviewing, and investigating, no trace of the Mitchell family could be found. Their car never appeared. No one reported seeing them, and they seemed to have vanished completely. The case began to attract attention from local news outlets, and soon the story of the missing Mitchell family was being discussed throughout the region. Theories began to emerge within the community. Some people believed that David had gotten involved with dangerous people and the family had been forced to run for their safety. Others thought that maybe David had been stealing money from his accounting firm and they had fled before being caught. A few neighbors wondered if the family had entered witness protection after seeing something they shouldn't have seen. Robert continued working the case for months, following every possible lead and investigating every theory. But as time passed without any new evidence or sightings, the case gradually grew cold. The Mitchell house was eventually sold to pay off their debts, and a new family moved in. But Robert never forgot about David, Lisa, Kate, and Amy, and he never stopped wondering what had really happened to the perfect family from Maple Street. The weeks turned into months, and the months stretched into years, but Mrs. Dorothy Chun never stopped thinking about the Mitchell family. What had started as concern for her missing neighbors slowly transformed into something much deeper and more consuming. She had become the unofficial guardian of their memory, the keeper of their story, and the one person who refused to let the world forget about David. Lisa, Kate, and Amy. At first, Dorothy had simply watered Lisa's flower garden to keep it from dying. It seemed like the right thing to do, a small gesture of hope that maybe the family would return and be grateful that someone had cared for the things they loved. But as weeks passed with no word from the Mitchells, Dorothy found herself doing more and more to maintain their property. She started collecting their mail, creating neat stacks and cardboard boxes in her garage. Bills, advertisements, Christmas cards from relatives who didn't know they were missing, birthday cards for the twins, newsletters from the church they used to attend. Dorothy kept everything, believing that someday it might be important, that maybe there would be a clue hidden in one of those envelopes that everyone else had missed. The bank eventually foreclosed on the Mitchell house after 6 months of unpaid mortgage payments. Dorothy watched with a heavy heart as strangers walked through the home, evaluating its worth and discussing renovations. She wanted to tell them about the love that had filled those rooms, about the laughter that had echoed through the hallways, about the perfect family that had made that house a true home. But she stayed silent, watching from her kitchen window as always. When the house went up for sale, Dorothy did something that surprised even herself. She contacted the real estate agent and asked if she could continue maintaining the yard until it sold. The agent, Mrs. Patricia Hughes, was grateful for the help and agreed immediately. Dorothy spent her days keeping the grass trimmed, the garden weeds pulled, and the walkways swept clean. Neighbors began to joke that the Mitchell house looked better empty than most houses looked with families living in them. Detective Thompson would stop by periodically to check on Dorothy and see if she had noticed anything unusual. She always invited him in for coffee and would share her theories about what might have happened to the family. Dorothy had developed several possibilities in her mind, each one carefully considered and supported by small details she had observed over the years. Her first theory was that David had been forced to relocate his family quickly due to some kind of threat. Maybe he had discovered something illegal at work, or perhaps someone from his past had found him and forced him to run. Dorothy had noticed that David had seemed more nervous than usual in the weeks before they disappeared, often checking over his shoulder when he worked in his yard. Her second theory involved Lisa. Dorothy had observed that Lisa had been receiving some unusual phone calls in the days before the disappearance. She had seen Lisa talking on the phone in her kitchen, looking upset and crying. Maybe Lisa had gotten involved in something dangerous. Or maybe someone from her past had reappeared and threatened her family. The third theory, and the one that kept Dorothy awake at night, was that something terrible had happened to the family right there in Riverside. Maybe they had never left at all. Maybe someone had hurt them and made it look like they had run away. This possibility haunted Dorothy because it meant that while everyone was looking for the family in distant places, they might have been nearby. All along, Dorothy started keeping detailed journals about her observations and theories. She wrote down everything she remembered about the family's last days, every conversation she had overheard, every small detail that might be important. She created timelines and drew maps, trying to piece together what had really happened. Her journals filled 3 notebooks in the first year alone. The Mitchell house sold after 8 months to a young couple named Brian and Nancy Foster. They were newlyweds who were excited about starting their lives together in such a beautiful neighborhood. Dorothy introduced herself on their first day and offered to help them get settled. She didn't mention the previous family at first, but when the Fosters asked about the neighbors, Dorothy felt obligated to tell them the truth. Brian and Nancy were shocked to learn about the disappearance, but they appreciated Dorothy's honesty. They were kind people who understood Dorothy's attachment to the property and didn't mind that she continued to take special care of the garden areas. In fact, Nancy was grateful for Dorothy's gardening expertise and often asked for advice about which flowers to plant and how to care for them. But Dorothy's relationship with the new owners became complicated as her obsession with the Mitchell mystery deepened. She would sometimes stand in her yard, staring at the house for long periods, remembering how it used to be. She would mention the Mitchell family in almost every conversation with Brian and Nancy, sharing memories and theories until they began to feel uncomfortable. Other neighbors started to worry about Dorothy's mental health. Her friend Margaret Williams, who lived 3 houses down, noticed that Dorothy had become increasingly isolated and focused only on the missing family. Margaret would invite Dorothy for coffee or shopping trips, but Dorothy always declined, saying she needed to stay home in case Detective Thompson called with news or in case someone came by asking questions about the Mitchells, Dorothy's own family became concerned about her behavior. Her daughter Susan, who lived across town, tried to convince her mother to see a counselor or take a vacation to get her mind off the disappearance. But Dorothy refused, insisting that she had a responsibility to keep the Mitchell family's memory alive. She felt that if she stopped watching, if she stopped caring, then the family would truly be forgotten forever. As years passed, Dorothy's house became an unofficial museum of Mitchell family memories. She had newspaper clippings about their disappearance covering one wall of her living room. She had copies of all the missing person flyers that had been distributed throughout the region. She even had photographs that Detective Thompson had shared with her, showing the family during happier times. Dorothy developed relationships with other families who had experienced similar disappearances. She joined online forums and support groups, sharing information and theories with people from across the country who were dealing with missing loved ones. She became known in these communities as someone who never gave up hope and who always encouraged others to keep searching for answers. Local reporters would occasionally contact Dorothy when they were writing anniversary stories about the Mitchell disappearance. She always agreed to interviews, seeing them as opportunities to keep the family's story in the public eye. She hoped that someday someone would see one of these articles and remember something important, some small detail that would break the case wide open. The Mitchell case had become Dorothy's life's work, her mission, her obsession. She had transformed from a quiet widow who enjoyed gardening into a determined investigator who refused to let a mystery go unsolved. Friends and family worried about her, but Dorothy believed that she was doing something important, something that mattered. She had no idea that the truth she sought was buried much closer to home than anyone had ever imagined, and that the answers she desperately wanted would eventually come at a price she never expected to pay. By 2023, Dorothy Shun was 89 years old and facing the hardest decision of her life. 3 months earlier, Dr. Wilson had delivered news that changed everything. The persistent cough she had been ignoring was actually lung cancer, and it had spread too far for treatment to help. He gave her maybe 6 months, possibly less, for 30 years. Dorothy had carried a secret so heavy that it had shaped every day of her life since the Mitchell family disappeared. Now, facing her final months, she found herself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to find any peace. The truth she had buried deep inside was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be heard before it was too late. Dorothy had always been a woman of strong faith, and she believed deeply that there would be consequences for the choices she had made. As death approached, the weight of her silence felt unbearable. She spent long nights sitting in her kitchen, looking out the same window where she had witnessed something that still haunted her dreams. 3 decades later, the decision to finally speak came on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. Dorothy had been reading her Bible, trying to find peace in the familiar words she had turned to throughout her life. But instead of comfort, she found only guilt and regret. She realized that her silence had not just hidden the truth about what happened to the Mitchell family, it had also robbed them of justice and proper burial. Detective Thompson had retired 15 years earlier, but Dorothy still had his phone number written in her address book. Her hands shook as she dialed, unsure if the number would still work or if he would even remember her after all these years. When he answered on the third ring, his voice sounded older, but still kind. "Detective Thompson? This is Dorothy Shun from Maple Street. I was the neighbor of the Mitchell family who disappeared 30 years ago." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I need to tell you something very important. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Robert Thompson had never forgotten the Mitchell case. Even in retirement, he would sometimes pull out the old files and review the evidence, wondering what he had missed. When Dorothy called, something in her voice told him immediately that this wasn't just another theory or remembered detail. This was different. They agreed to meet at Dorothy's house that afternoon. As she waited for him to arrive, Dorothy walked through her home, looking at all the Mitchell family memorabilia she had collected over the years. The newspaper clippings, the photographs, the timelines she had created, all of it felt different now, knowing that she held the key to solving the mystery that had consumed her life. When Detective Thompson arrived, Dorothy could see that retirement had been kind to him. He looked healthier and more relaxed than she remembered, but his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had made him such a good investigator. He accepted her offer of coffee and sat patiently while she struggled to find the words to begin. "I lied to you 30 years ago," Dorothy finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not about everything, but about the most important thing. I told you I saw David loading suitcases into his car that Saturday night, and that was true. But I didn't tell you what I saw him doing later that same night." Detective Thompson leaned forward, sensing that he was about to hear something that would change everything about the case that had never left his thoughts. Dorothy took a deep breath and continued, tears already forming in her eyes. "I couldn't sleep that night. It was unusual for me to see any activity so late at the Mitchell house, so I kept getting up to look out my bedroom window. Around 2 in the morning, I saw David in their backyard with a shovel. He was digging in Lisa's flower garden, the one she was so proud of." Dorothy paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. The words were becoming harder to say, but she forced herself to continue. "At first, I thought maybe he was doing some kind of late-night gardening project, but something felt wrong about it. He kept looking around like he was afraid someone would see him, and he was working so frantically. I watched him dig for hours." Detective Thompson remained silent, letting Dorothy tell her story at her own pace. He could see how difficult this was for her, and he understood that pushing her would only make it harder. "The next morning, when I saw him putting those suitcases in the car, I realized that only David was moving around. The shapes in the car that I thought were his family, they weren't moving like people should move. They looked stiff, unnatural. That's when I started to understand what I had really witnessed the night before." The room fell quiet except for the sound of Dorothy's quiet crying. Detective Thompson reached across the table and gently touched her hand, encouraging her to continue when she was ready. "I was so scared," Dorothy whispered. "I was an old woman living alone, and David Mitchell had always seemed like such a perfect man, such a loving father and husband. Who would believe that he could do something so terrible? And what if I was wrong? What if I accused an innocent man of something horrible based on what I thought I saw in the dark?" Dorothy explained how the fear had paralyzed her in those crucial first days. When Detective Thompson had interviewed her, she had convinced herself that she might have misunderstood what she saw. Maybe David really was just doing some garden work, and maybe the family really had left together for some unknown reason. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, I knew in my heart what had really happened, Dorothy continued. By then, I felt like it was too late to tell the truth. I had already lied to the police, and I was terrified that I would get in trouble for not speaking up sooner. So I just kept quiet, year after year, carrying this terrible secret. Dorothy described how the guilt had eaten away at her over the decades. She had dedicated her life to keeping the Mitchell family's memory alive, but she now realized that her efforts had been a way of trying to make up for her silence. Every flower she planted in their memory, every interview she gave to reporters, every theory she shared with other families dealing with missing loved ones, it had all been her way of trying to balance the scales for her cowardice. "I've been living with this knowledge for 30 years, Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger despite her tears. "I've watched that family be remembered as missing people when they deserve to be remembered as victims. I've watched their extended family wonder and hope when they deserve to know the truth and have closure." Detective Thompson listened to every word, his mind already working through the implications of Dorothy's revelation. After 30 years, physical evidence would be difficult to find. But if Dorothy was right about what she saw, there might still be enough to finally solve the case that had haunted both of them for so long. "Dorothy," he said gently, "you're doing the right thing by telling me this now. I know it took incredible courage, and I want you to know that no one will blame you for being afraid. What matters is that you're speaking up now when it can still make a difference." As the afternoon sunlight faded, Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in 30 years, a sense of relief. The secret that had weighed her down for so long was finally free, and whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. The truth was out, and the Mitchell family would finally get the justice they deserved. Detective Thompson left Dorothy's house that evening with his mind racing. After 30 years of wondering what had happened to the Mitchell family, he finally had a lead that could solve the case. But he also knew that getting permission to excavate a property based on the testimony of an elderly woman recalling events from 3 decades ago would not be easy. The next morning, Robert contacted his former colleagues at the Riverside Police Department. The current detective handling cold cases was Detective Maria Rodriguez, a sharp investigator who had heard about the Mitchell case but had never worked on it directly. When Robert explained Dorothy's revelation, Maria listened carefully and agreed that they needed to pursue this lead. Despite the challenges they would face, getting a search warrant required convincing a judge that Dorothy's testimony was credible, and that there was probable cause to believe evidence of a crime could be found on the property. Maria and Robert spent days preparing their case, gathering all the original evidence from 1993 and documenting Dorothy's 30-year involvement with the case. They interviewed Dorothy again, this time officially, recording her statement about what she had witnessed that October night. Despite her age and illness, Dorothy's memory of that evening was remarkably clear. She described exactly where David had been digging, how long he had worked, and what tools she had seen him using. Her detailed account, combined with her decades of credible involvement in the case, helped convince the judge to grant the search warrant. Brian and Nancy Foster, who still lived in the former Mitchell house, were shocked when police arrived with the warrant. They had known about the family's disappearance, of course, but they had never imagined that the answer to the mystery might be buried in their own backyard. They cooperated fully with the investigation, moving their children to stay with relatives while the excavation took place. The search team included forensic experts, crime scene technicians, and specialized equipment for ground-penetrating radar. They started by scanning the entire backyard, looking for any disturbances in the soil that might indicate something had been buried years ago. The technology had advanced significantly since 1993, making it possible to detect changes in soil composition even after decades. Dorothy watched from her kitchen window as the investigation unfolded in the yard she had lovingly maintained for so many years. It felt surreal to see police cars and forensic equipment where she had once watched Kate and Amy play on their swing set. Part of her hoped she had been wrong about what she saw that night, while another part of her prayed that the truth would finally be revealed. The ground-penetrating radar detected several anomalies in the soil, particularly in the area where Lisa's rose garden had been located. This was exactly where Dorothy had seen David digging that night 30 years ago. The forensic team carefully marked the locations and began the delicate process of excavation. On the second day of digging, they found the first evidence that Dorothy's terrible suspicions had been correct. About 4 feet down in the rich soil where Lisa's prized roses had once bloomed, they discovered human remains. The forensic anthropologist on the team immediately recognized that these were not recent burials. The condition of the remains was consistent with being in the ground for approximately 30 years. As the excavation continued over the following days, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. The remains of 3 people were found buried in what had once been the most beautiful garden on Maple Street. Lisa, Kate, and Amy Mitchell had been there all along, beneath the flowers that Dorothy had so carefully tended year after year. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed what everyone now suspected. The 3 family members had died around the time of their disappearance in 1993. While the exact cause of death would require further examination, it was clear that this was not a case of accidental death or natural causes. This was a case of murder. With this evidence, Detective Rodriguez reopened the investigation into David Mitchell's whereabouts. Using modern technology and international databases that hadn't existed in 1993, they began tracing his movements after he left Riverside. It didn't take long to discover that David had been living under an assumed name in Argentina for most of the past 30 years. The investigation revealed that David had been stealing money from his accounting firm for over 2 years before the family's disappearance. He had been skimming small amounts from client accounts, hoping no one would notice. But by October 1993, an annual audit was approaching that would have exposed his crimes. Facing certain discovery, imprisonment, and the destruction of his perfect reputation, David had made a decision that was beyond comprehension. Records showed that David had purchased a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires using a false identity just days after his family's disappearance. He had lived quietly in Argentina for nearly 3 decades, working small jobs and avoiding any situation that might draw attention to his past. But his story had come to an end in 2018, when he died of a heart attack in a small clinic outside Buenos Aires. Never knowing that his crimes would eventually be discovered, the news of the discovery sent shockwaves through Riverside and the wider community that had followed the Mitchell case over the years. For 30 years, people had wondered if the family was living somewhere under new identities, if they had been kidnapped, or if they had met with some terrible accident. No one had imagined that the perfect father and husband had been capable of such an unthinkable act. Dorothy felt a complex mixture of emotions as the truth finally came to light. There was relief that her 30 years of silence were finally over, and that the Mitchell family would receive the proper burial they deserved. But there was also tremendous sadness knowing that her suspicions had been correct, and that Lisa, Kate, and Amy had been so close all these years. While everyone searched for them in distant places, the community came together to support Dorothy. During this difficult time, neighbors who had sometimes thought her obsession with the Mitchell family was unhealthy now understood that she had been carrying an enormous burden all these years. They organized meals and visits, making sure she wasn't alone as she dealt with both her terminal diagnosis and the emotional impact of the case's resolution. A proper funeral was held for Lisa, Kate, and Amy Mitchell. The entire community attended, finally able to say goodbye to the family that had been taken from them so suddenly. Dorothy sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the pastor speak about the love and joy the family had brought to everyone who knew them. Detective Thompson visited Dorothy one last time a few weeks after the funeral. He thanked her for her courage in finally coming forward, and he assured her that her actions had brought justice and closure to one of the most heartbreaking cases he had ever worked on. Dorothy told him that she finally felt at peace, knowing that she had done the right thing before it was too late. Dorothy Chun passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months later, surrounded by family and friends who now understood the incredible strength it had taken for her to carry such a heavy secret for so long. She had lived to see justice served for the family she had loved like her own, and she had found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. The Mitchell house was eventually sold again, but not before a small memorial garden was planted in the backyard where the family had been found. The new owners, understanding the history of their home, agreed to maintain the garden as a place of remembrance for Lisa, Kate, and Amy Mitchell, ensuring that their memory would live on in the neighborhood where they had once been so loved.